Well, isn't that wonderful? Little Natalie Merchant and 10,000 Maniacs. Hey, Jack Kerouac to start us out. I don't want to give anything away, but that name's going to come up a few times today. First of all, let me tell you my name. My name is Max Owre. I'm Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities. I want to welcome all of you to our first edition of Lunch with Friends and Strangers, Carolina Public Humanities biography series, in which we bring on a friend, a member of the UNC faculty, who brings a stranger, someone who might not be a stranger by name, but maybe a famous person, someone you never heard of before, but someone we're going to get to know better today. Before I begin, I want to thank a few people. I certainly want to thank all of our sponsors. Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley has been a wonderful supporter of our programs, especially our K-12 programs. I also want to thank, of course, Carolina Meadows, a retirement community who support both our K-12 programs and our public-facing programs, and our partner in publicizing and promoting a whole host of programs, both live when we're not in this COVID world, and of course in this virtual setting. The General Alumni Association are great partners. So please look at all of those wonderful organizations, and we thank them for their great support and partnership. I would also want to just key your attention to Carolina Public Humanities, what we're doing in this COVID time to make you aware that we are working really hard on other fronts besides these public-facing programs with our Carolina K-12 teacher workshop programs, which have been running and supporting teachers throughout the state, getting them wonderful access to UNC scholarship and faculty, and of course our community college partnerships. All of these programs have been changed dramatically in the last year, as you can imagine, but we are still working very hard on those fronts to reach those constituencies and those communities. If you'd like to support us in any of our efforts, you can go to humanities.unc.edu, and there's a wonderful donate button there. We'd love your support to help us continue reaching those people. And soon enough, we'll see you live again. I know it's coming down the pike. Let's not dally anymore. First, let's bring on our friend, and our friend is none other than, I'll have him turn on the microphone, turn on his camera here. Our friend is none other than Dr. Hassan Melehy. He is a professor of French here at the University of North Carolina. And it's always interesting when people say, Jack Kerouac, didn't he write in English? And this is a really wonderful thing we're going to learn about Jack Kerouac, if you didn't know it already, is that it is absolutely appropriate that a professor of French should be studying Jack Kerouac. Welcome, Hassan. Delighted to have you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Max. Appreciate being here.
Great. And of course, I'm going to quickly share the screen to bring on our stranger, who has by name is probably not a stranger to anyone here, and that is none other than Jack Kerouac. What can you tell us about just this picture, just to sort of start us out?
Well, this is from Allen Ginsberg's collection. I mean, he took it himself. It's from, and this was, I think this was first published in a collection of Allen Ginsberg's photos, and it was a show that traveled around for a little while. I saw it in New York City at NYU, of Allen Ginsberg's photos, not just of Kerouac, because it started in the 40s and went up through Ginsberg's death in the 90s. He was an amateur photographer, and he just took pictures of all of his friends mainly. And this is Kerouac in about, fall 1953. Yeah. The caption says that's in front of Tompkins Square Park. If you've been down, it's on it's in the East Village on 1st or 2nd Avenue, and it looks exactly the same now, except for the cars. I mean, it's
and the housing prices are considerably higher, I'm sure.
A bit, yeah. In those days, you moved there because it was cheap. I mean, when my friend David Amram, for example, got out of the army and decided to move to New York City to become he was a jazz musician, but to learn to become a composer, went to Manhattan College of Music. He lived there because it was dirt cheap. Yeah. And then he met tons of artists and musicians there too. It's
the way the artists come first, then the housing prices go up considerably later.
Yeah, and it took some time.
Yeah.
But
so what's interesting about this picture taken by Allen Ginsberg, I guess we want to start sort of with a broad view of just of Jack Kerouac. And what's interesting, of course, Jack Kerouac is always thrown in with the beats, with the beat generation and the Allen Ginsberg, Burroughs. Yeah. All the beat writers. So how do you pull an artist outside of a movement, and how can we appreciate him as not just being sort of grouped in with Allen Ginsberg and others?
Yeah. Well, that's something that it's been a discussion that's been going on for a very long time. I mean, the beat scholars talk about it, and that's the thing. They even have to identify themselves as beat scholars, but they want to indicate that the stereotypes that bring them all together are wrong. I mean, that's been the thrust of a number of books lately. By Stephen Boletto, who teaches at Lafayette College, has written a literary history of the Beat Generation, in which that's one of his tasks, is to bring them out of that. But it's also a discussion they've had for years and years and years. I've been very good friends with several of Kerouac's close friends, Joyce Johnson, and then who was very, very close to him. I can say more about that later if it comes up. And then David Amram, I mentioned to you earlier, musician, composers. Yes, I just mentioned it here too. Yes, so yeah, musician, composer who did shows with Kerouac, poetry and readings and so forth. And that's part of his act now. He always talks about Kerouac, always plays music about Kerouac. And yeah, that both of them have said the beat generation is such a label. It's such a label that it's so hard to get out of. Whereas, the writers, we did different things. I mean, for a little while, yes, we hung out together, we talked, we shared certain interests, certain approaches to art and music and literature, but we went in separate directions. Not that everything we did from the start had a huge amount in common anyway. I mean, there were certain things they talked about, wanting to get it rawer experience, wanting to get past all kinds of censorship, both social censorship and psychological censorship in their writing, practicing writing techniques. Looking back to the surrealists who had done that, who had tried to find writing techniques that would push past censorship of the conscious mind. And they shared experiences. So, I mean, and given that they were often writing about their experiences were often a basis of what they were writing about. So, some of we see
this image we might have where people sort of think of the Beats as almost like the Rat Pack, where you're going to have all these people hanging out together all the time and sharing writing together. It's just that, again, it's their points of contact that make sense to put them together, but we really should understand them as individual artists.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yes, because Kerouac never once wore a beret that I'm aware of, but he by 1962, 1963, he said that people were asking him why he wasn't wearing a beret.
And there you go.
It's just there was a media stereotype that came up really fast, involving messy apartments, cigarette holders. I mean, which just didn't correspond with their life. I mean, not at all. It just, I'm sure there were some messy apartments, but lots of people have messy apartments. I mean, it's nothing
celebrated as a cultural phenomena. That's probably of more value to people that aren't even in the experience, thinking about what this romantic life in New York City must be like, with berets and cigarettes, sort of like the left bank of Paris, if you will.
Well, the initial stereotypes were kind of contemptuous in that respect, but then there was the crowd that took it on as their own, and you had these young college type hipsters. And Kerouac, in a 1965 novel, Desolation Angels, speaks of an experience. They're in Morocco in the late 50s, I think, early 60s. The beatnik thing is taken off in America, and he says all these kids come up, and he criticizes the characters based on Allen Ginsberg in that novel. He says just eating it right up, these kids being total fans of theirs. And the thing he criticizes the most is they're saying like every other word, like, let's go down, like man. And I know a lot of people who are adults, who are academics, who do that. And one of the reasons they do that is they think they're kind of in this train of, in this trend, in this long-standing trend of hipness. But Kerouac couldn't stand people who talk that way.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Then we have a sort of resurgence in the 21st century of the like among the younger folks. So perhaps they're all beat wannabes. It's interesting too. The age difference, I think, is interesting as well, because many people are coming to New York City in their early 20s, say in the late 50s, to be part of the beat scene, and he's already considerably older than all of them, having gone through his formative years.
Yeah.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about his formative years and get right to his birth. Where was he born? Where was he raised? And what was this like?
Lowell, Massachusetts, 1922, and he was born in a French-Canadian community. At that time, there were French-speaking communities all over New England, mainly in the industrial towns. It was a large wave of immigration that had taken place between 1840 and 1930, mainly, which involved, during those years, 900,000 people, during those 90 years, there were 1.8 million Francophone residents of Quebec, Francophone citizens, Canadian citizens who were of Quebec. So there was half the population during that period that left.
Wow.
during that time. And things that happened were 1840 is 2 years after the Lower Canada Rebellion.
Yeah.
Which was the attempt of Francophones to establish their own country, really to establish independence from British rule, because the British were not, they were second-class citizens at best under British rule, which had happened at the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s. Quebec fell in 1759.
And despite the Quebec Act, they were still second-class citizens up there.
Yes, they were. Yeah, in fact, I mean, they were. Yes, and I mean, and then in 1840, after the rebellion, the official British policy was to assimilate them. They said this is a racial issue. They actually said that this is a racial problem. They said, how are we going to do? And race was considered somewhat differently then. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, obviously, they weren't talking about changing their appearance, but they were talking about changing all of their habits and ways of life, the language they spoke. The policy was to eradicate French.
Yeah.
And to convert them all to Protestantism. Well, there was obviously resistance to this.
And so he is raised, so born in 1922, he's in this community. It sounds to me in a community that by this point has a few generations of establishment, if you know, 1840 to, you know, at least a couple generations.
By 1900, the population of the French-speaking population of Massachusetts, all of whom, well, just about all of whom had come from Quebec, was 13%.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. So this is like, and there were some towns, Lowell was around 20 to 25% French speaking. I mean, the towns around where I grew up in northeastern Connecticut, Willimantic, Connecticut was at one point during those years about 60% French speaking.
Wow.
An industrial town that was the thread capital of the world then. Putnam, Connecticut, another big mill town. It was a mill town. It was 90% French speaking.
That's incredible. So was his family were they laborers in the mills? Is that where he came from? And his own?
No, actually, curiously enough, Kerouac's father, let me see, Kerouac's grandfather, his grandfather had come. Well, his father, okay, the family had immigrated when his father was a little boy to Nashua, New Hampshire. And the mother also around that time too. And yes, the mother had worked in the factory from the time she was about 13 years old. Okay. But the father, Kerouac's father's father, was actually a successful businessman who actually sent his son to prep school in Rhode Island for a little while. Not for very long. He couldn't do it for very many years, but during those years, he picked up articulateness, complete fluency in English. So he actually was, his trade was he was a journeyman printer.
Okay.
But in those days, I mean, in that community, he was also a journalist. But that's the thing: people working on the newspapers did everything. He was a printer and writer, and he was the only writer in Nashua. And then he actually moved to Lowell to work on the newspaper there. L'Etoile, it was called, the Star. And he was the only journalist who was completely fluent in both languages, could translate perfectly in both directions.
This has to have had a formative influence on Jack Kerouac, in that he has an example of a literary, parent.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And both his parents were readers, and even though by accounts his mother's English was somewhat broken when she spoke, I have read letters she wrote to him. They're completely fluent. Both parents had a really, really, really strong sense of written language.
Which brings us to an interesting point. So both parents can write English well, yet their household is a French-speaking household.
Yes, well, that was their neighborhood. The father was completely fluent in both languages. The mother knew, I don't actually know how much English Kerouac's mother knew at that time. It was always very much her second language. She preferred to communicate in French. They always spoke in French, even though the letters I've seen she wrote to him in English. But yeah, the neighborhood was French, and French was just the default language. When he went to school at the age of 6, this is 1928. What had happened was when the communities had been established in southern New England, or around New England, mainly in southern New England, the industrial cities, they had taken everything with them, including the Catholicism. That was a really important part of Quebecois culture. I mean, preserve everything through religion, the language. And so there were parochial schools in every town. There were French parochial schools in every town that taught, and they taught first 4 hours I think it was first 4 hours in English, second 4 hours in French. They said the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag at 8. They said the Pledge of Allegiance to the Carillon Sacré-Cœur flag at noon. And the idea was to be completely fluent in both languages, fluent in French to preserve the heritage, fluent in English so you could make a mark in the United States as an American citizen of French Canadian heritage, preserving that in the broader culture.
So his schooling takes place in the local parochial schools. How about by the time he gets to high school? Is he still in the local parochial schools?
No, at the age of 11, his father, well, he transferred to public school at that point, and he skipped a grade. So what would that be at 11? I think he went straight in. You would normally go into 6th grade. He went into 7th grade so he was in junior high basically when he was 11.
We get to say he was a good student in that he goes to Columbia. He goes to New York eventually. So
yes, he was a very good student. His teachers thought very highly of him. But he went to Columbia on a football scholarship. I mean, he was one of the best football players in Massachusetts.
Interesting. So he played at Columbia?
Yes, he did. Not for very long. Yes, this is all the details. I believe the first season, and then in the second season, he was actually injured. And he came in and out of Columbia. He broke his leg. And he came in and out of Columbia for several years after that. Didn't play football, or I think there was a little while where he tried again, but he didn't. And then Columbia, they didn't yank the scholarship for his not being a football player at that point. It's just, but he didn't finish at Columbia. But he did a number of years, and his favorite subject was English. And he was very proud that he'd gotten an A from Mark Van Doren, who the famous literary critic, whose son Charles Van Doren was a famous quiz show guy who got in big trouble for that.
Sure.
Yeah. So anyway,
he's studying English as his favorite subject. Is he being influenced by the modernist writers at this point? Is he reading Joyce? Is he reading Faulkner? Who is he reading?
That came a little bit later. He's mainly reading. Okay, what he did was he started picking up. He was reading in the Columbia Great Books program. So I mean. The Columbia Great Books program, which was designed to give it was a very, very progressive populist idea to educate people in the great classics. So he was reading with Mark Van Doren. He read Shakespeare. I mean the modernist writers came a little bit later. The interest in Joyce. I can't tell you exactly when that was. By the end of the 40s, he and his friends are talking all about Joyce.
Well, before we get to the end of the 40s, we know that he's, just doing the math, if he's born in 1922, World War II is coming up. Can you speak a little bit about his time? I know it was not necessarily what we call a successful stint.
Well, he first of all, he was in the Merchant Marine. And so that was one of the things he and several of the others, Ginsberg also had a Merchant Marine position. He got out of Columbia that way, and he traveled that way.
Did he do the convoys across the Atlantic?
He did. Yeah. In fact, he witnessed, and I'm sorry, he witnessed the sinking of a ship, of a naval vessel, because they would do these, they would be escorted by naval. He witnessed the sinking of a naval vessel. The ship he was on its next voyage was sunk.
Yeah, people don't give enough credit. What a terrible, terrible duty that was in those convoys.
Yeah. Oh, it was scary. I mean, you're watching the ship that's escorting you burn and sink in the middle of the ocean. I mean, and then you're hoping you can make it across to the port. It's just, of course. And then he was actually in the Navy for a short time, but was discharged. Mm-hmm. And he was actually hospitalized because he refused to fire a rifle. And he was then put under psychiatric observation. They actually did say he was schizophrenic, and apparently the diagnosis was based on he had written a novel that he subsequently said was worthless. He said it was a crock as literature. It was published about 10, 15 years ago.
Is this the novel that he wrote about his time at sea, or?
No. Well, it's called The Sea Is My Brother. So there's a little bit about the sea, and it's mainly about going back and forth between Boston area and Hartford, and there's a little bit about the sea, and then New York City.
You don't need to go across the sea to get from Boston to Hartford. I have that.
No. But there's some merchant marine activity in it. Yes, there is. But he sets up in a fairly. I mean, he was young when he did this, his first effort. Something that really comes up in all of his novels again, which is a dualism between the characters. One type of character and then the opposite type of character, and then they're drawn together. And on that basis, apparently, from what I've read, the Navy psychiatrists judged him schizophrenic. They said he had these two different parts of his personality.
They read his work to make an evaluation.
They were after him, though. They really wanted to nail him. Yeah.
So let's get to, I mean, obviously we need to be talking about him as a writer. So let's get to, when does he start thinking of himself as writing is something I want to do and I want to produce for people?
When does he start doing that?
When does this become a decision that this is what I'm going to do? I'm going to write.
Well, he was writing from the age of, he was writing from the time he was a child. I mean, as soon as he could put words on paper, he did. And he wrote little stories when, I think at the age of, I mean, as soon as he could write, he did. And he would make up stories too about, and he had this, he would do some play acting. He had this character that he went around the neighborhood in at night, which later, I mean, if you want to look at literary genealogies, it's more or less what becomes Dr. Sachs much later in his novel about the sinister figure based on the shadow, Lamont Cranston, who goes around at night in Lowell. And he went around with a cape. And he named that character actually Dr. Malodorous because he had seen the word malodorous. Yeah. And he loved words, and Joyce Johnson talks wonderfully about this. She said he didn't seem to know what it meant, but he loved the sound, and he didn't pronounce it either. It was because he was still coming to English as a foreign language. So Dr. Malodorous.
It sounds better than Dr. Stink, right?
Yeah. But he's doing that, and in his father's, he had typewriters available because his father was a printer, and he typed, and he printed stories too. He actually made his own little printed stories, but when he was like 12, 13 years old. I mean, it's
So is this Juvenilia still exist, or people?
No, I think it was at the age of when he was 14. His sister, who did not think who wanted to steer him away from this because they knew he was talented, they thought he could make some money. They knew he was the talented boy in the family. So writing was only, I mean, his sister never had respect for him as a writer. She died in 1965, but she was always trying to steer him away from writing, that he could do far better at another profession.
To be a businessman or something.
She destroyed everything when he was 14.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So he had, but yes, everything, after that, he saved everything, and every single thing, as Joyce once put it, I heard her put it, anything with writing on it, he saved from the age of 14 on.
Well, then I suppose we should then take a look at some of what he was writing, and when we do get a sense of what he's sharing. So here we have, and can we see this now? The Town and the City.
Yes, that's his first novel.
First novel, publication date?
1950.
1950.
Yeah.
So he's was he writing this? Do we know how long he was preparing this text? Any sense of?
Yeah, mostly written 1947 to 1949, but there are earlier versions of the same story. He wanted to write about his hometown of Lowell. In the novel, it's a town in Massachusetts called Galloway, but the geographical features, it's on the Merrimack, it's not far from the New Hampshire line. It fits exactly Lowell, an industrial town in southern New England, in Massachusetts.
So is that town in the title? Is that the town, or
yes,
is it
the town, and the city is New York. And
okay.
Then so the town, and I mean, it echoes Thomas Wolfe's Of Time in the River. I mean, Thomas Wolfe was actually one of his favorite novelists when he was young. It's what younger people were reading at Columbia. You asked about avant-garde novelists earlier. That came a little later. Thomas Wolfe was his hero at this point. And in fact, I mean, Thomas Wolfe was everyone's hero. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was still alive, who founded City Lights Books and published Howl, among other things, and many, many other poets. He went to the University of North Carolina. He was from a family in the Bronx, or Yonkers, actually, and he came to the University of North Carolina because of Thomas Wolfe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of Wolfe fans, if you will, in that age cohort.
But this book, he wanted to write a novel about drawing on his experiences. I mean, which is something a lot of, not all, but a lot of first novel, a lot of people do for their first novel.
And Sam, when you say drawing on his experiences, where his experiences growing up, or his experiences?
Yes, okay. His experiences growing up through college, because it ends with let me see, his character of you have Peter. Yeah, because it's a big family in Lowell, and he writes about a big family. It's not exactly his family. I mean, it's because he had a sister. He grew up with a sister. So this was this was a, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to remember some things about this. So he basically wanted to write an autobiographical novel, and differently from all of his other novels, this is written in the third person. He's narrating his protagonist from the third person, and the narration goes from protagonist to protagonist.
Okay.
And it's the Martin family in Massachusetts, and they are largely Anglo, and mind you, this was an issue for him. Like, should I make this a French Canadian family or not? And should I make this a French Canadian family or not? And he decided not to, because he wanted to make it a more a family that was more available to Anglo-American families. So he said that he chose the name Martin because it could be Martin,
Okay.
But the father is very clearly an Anglo. The mother is of French Canadian origin.
Okay, so did he see commonalities in what he might call the working class communities or of these towns, that he could say, I can make this, I can sort of scrub the French Canadian out of this and still get a lesson about this type of life?
Yes, I think that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to write for a large American audience, and he saw that as a mainly Anglophone audience.
He gets it published.
Yes, he got it published, and that was it was a very long novel. The original manuscript was 1,000 pages long. It was cut to about 300 by his editor was Robert Giroux, also of French Canadian origin, curiously enough, who had gone to Columbia and had been Mark Van Doren's student and was an editor at Harcourt Brace. Kerouac got the novel to Mark Van Doren, who had thought highly of him as a student, and Van Doren got it to Giroux, and it was published.
And then we see these. So how is it? What are we looking at here? These are reviews here, obviously in a French publication.
And this brings it back to, he was from the French Canadian community. French Canadians were interested in their own becoming prominent. You'll notice. Okay, we didn't notice. He went by John Kerouac. I'm sorry, I didn't even point that out.
Interesting point there. Yeah, John Kerouac. Right?
Yeah. He just went ahead with Jack later on. But anyway, so we can go to the next slide then. So this was, one of the reasons I brought this out, because it may surprise people to know that cities in Massachusetts, even up till 1950, had French language newspapers.
Was this called Le Travailleur or something like that?
Le Travailleur, yes, which means the laborer.
Yep.
And it says in English, weekly devoted exclusively to the recording and the promotion of Franco-American arrest. Published in Worcester, Massachusetts. This actually published until 1978. It folded in 1978. Wow. By Wilfred Beaulieu, who hated Assumption College because Assumption College decided after the Second World War to go to mainly English instruction. It had been a Catholic French language school. It's still open. Assumption College is still there in Worcester. They house actually the Franco-American archive. That's where I found this newspaper. It's
interesting.
Yes.
What does the general review say about it? Is it
she generally praises it. Paul Bonici's father went to Assumption College. Wow.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. And she mainly praises it, but she criticizes him for leaving out the heritage. She says he paints a wonderful picture of the immigrant communities in Lowell, and she says Galloway is Lowell. We know that. And he was 27 when it was published. He mentioned John Kerouac is an animateur de première force. He's a first class animator. He's really good at bringing this to life. He's great. She says he's a first class, vivid fiction writer. He knows how to populate. Anyway, he knows how to populate a setting with a just active
trépidant,
frémissant, because
these are words that I read in French and understand and can't translate immediately.
He was not. One of the reasons people didn't like this novel in Lowell, because he went ahead and talked about the seedier sides of Lowell. I mean, he has gay characters in it, and in those days, I mean, gay life was not public at all. You had things like, gay life consisted of pickups in dark alleys in the middle of the night. He wrote about this. He wrote that he just, as a matter of fact, that this kind of thing went on, that there were drug addicts in town. You know, people didn't like this very much.
Yeah, people love it when you shine a light on their town, but don't shine it too brightly. You know, don't.
Yvonne Lemaitre, who was also originally from Lowell, but who had also, she'd been a journalist in Paris for some time herself. And she was writing book reviews for this, she'd written about a lot of things, but she was writing book reviews at this point and wrote this one and actually praised him. She praised the things that they didn't like in Lowell. You know, she says, this is a great portrait of life. However, she says he's left out the ancestors. She says something like he has the let me see, what was exactly the expression? It was something like he's drawing the sap, but he's leaving out the roots. And she says, imagine Hamlet without the prince. That's the line she uses.
Wow. Yeah.
And he wrote a letter back to her. The review came out in 1950. He wrote a letter back to her where he thanks her very much and says, I loved reading. It was like reading the French was like a very aunt of mine who'd had written this, you know. And he says, but yes, I left out, this is where he's very explicit about it. I left out the French Canadian heritage because I wanted to write an American novel. He says, but you have taught me, I will never hide it again. I will never hide it again. I'll never hide my French Canadian heritage again. And I am going to write a novel in French, but it's going to have to be a very simple French because I'm so far from the French language.
Interesting.
You know,
so,
so
this, I mean, no offense to Le Travailleur, but it seems like this is not the where you're going to hope to get your novel critiqued. Was it also, how about criticism in larger press? What was the reception of John Kerouac at this?
The New York Times basically said it's a pretty good first novel, which is that's not gonna make it sell. That's not gonna make the copies fly off the stands.
And did it sell?
No, not particularly. No.
Okay.
No, it didn't. Yeah.
Well, I know that, you know, it's very early on then that we have the opportunity to get to what everyone knows, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is his second work, and let's spend a little time on this.
Yeah, okay. So this he wrote this in April 19, the first version. Mind you, it went through quite a few versions. Mm-hmm. There are five distinct manuscripts of it between this and publication. And the legend is that he wrote this explosive, uncensored book on a 120-foot roll of paper. It was on 100 foot, and then the publishers censored it all. That's not what happened, really. Yes, the censors did have certain concerns, but a lot of the decisions for changes were purely his own.
And the source material for this are, of course, the Travels with Cassidy.
Yeah.
And what were the years of those the years?
1947 to 1950.
So he's writing The Town and the City.
Yeah.
In between his travels, and while he's writing,
he was finishing The Town and the City during the time that the travels are taking place. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Is there anything noteworthy about the travels themselves that you can speak to?
Well, I mean, I think that they've inspired generations of people. I myself hitchhiked across the country after I read the book. I mean, it's it was just what's really wonderful about it is he just vividly describes every place he goes. You know, every time he gets to Des Moines, Iowa, and he talks about the freight yards and this hotel he stays in. You know, it's just he talks about the people he meets and just these exuberant descriptions of all kinds of people in America. And he doesn't shy away at all from ethnic communities. You know, he goes into a Black neighborhood. He describes what that's like. He describes meeting Spanish-speaking people. He describes what that's like. He describes what New Orleans is like. You know, he describes, you know, the fact that New Orleans is segregated, but William Burroughs says there's certain Black bars you can go to and they're better. You know,
was he drawn to these types of communities because of his own background?
That's the way I understand it. Yeah. Yes, he understood America as a very multicultural place. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate that he's been pegged as a racist for some of his depictions of these non-white populations that seem at times to draw on stereotype. And sometimes I think that's deliberate because he's painting his character Sal Paradise, and he gave his narrator the name Sal Paradise. It's like he's supposed to be naive. Mm-hmm. So he tends to see things through stereotypes, but then what happens is oftentimes we get the stereotype and then things get much more complicated after the stereotype. Mm-hmm. It's like this moment of, oh, I see this beauty here. Oh, wait, things are much more complicated. So it's all that much more surprising when things get more complicated, you know, for the narrator. He can give his narrator these types of experience. Kerouac was not as naive as his narrator is.
Okay.
So that's another thing. People think this was just a relation of experiences. It was far from that.
Mhm.
I
There
mean,
was
yes, it drew on experiences, but it's a very literary novel in that he does a lot to give his readers something other than, you know, a pure and simple narrative. It's
in a sense, there are thesis isn't quite the right word for what I'm looking for, but there are themes that are very easily identifiable that are
yeah.
not just relational of experience. For example, this multicultural idea,
Oh yeah,
you know,
yeah.
seeing
Well,
this
that
is
was,
something that you could read the book from a
yeah.
thematic perspective and
And then
not just, yeah.
and what happens is Sal Paradise gets interested in this and he wants to live among them, and he says, I'd be happier among these, but I can't do that. I want to be white. He says, I have white ambitions. And Sal Paradise is an Italian American. That's what he did to it. Who speaks Italian with his mother. You know, he couldn't even in On the Road stick to the French Canadian part. The original manuscript is French Canadian, but he changed it to Italian for the broader audience. There were more Italian Americans than French Canadians at that time.
You're going to get a lot more of those communities spread out, not just in New England, these Italian communities
Right.
throughout
Yeah.
the country.
So
Let's talk a little bit about the timeline from the road trip to the writing to the publication. When was On the Road published, and how long between?
1957. It took,
Yeah.
so he wrote the original manuscript in a famous burst of writing in 3 weeks, April 1951. And he deliberately did that. He taped, he made a single roll of paper out of it. I mean, and he said to avoid changing sheets.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a little bit more to it than that. Because yeah, he taped 12-foot pieces of architect's paper together until he had 120 feet. I think it's maybe 12. I think they varied somewhat in length. So it's about, I can't remember the exact number of sheets, but yeah, it's 120 feet, and it just rolls it through continuously the paper. Yes, he doesn't have to change sheets, but at the same time, he's interested in this idea of the book itself looking like a road. In fact, there's one point where they're driving across Nebraska, and he says the road unfolded in front of us like a roll of paper.
There you go.
Yeah. So the whole idea is that and he said so after he rolled it out on the floor. He said it looks like a road. You know, he wrote that in a letter. So the idea was that the writing itself mimicked the travel. You know, and
that's a really interesting. So he goes on the road. He several years later, 3 or 4 years later, I assume he has notes and whatnot that he's working out of, and he sits down and he writes this in 3 weeks, and then it takes that long to be published.
Well, and yes, it did. It took what was it? Yeah, because he at first took it to Robert Giroux, and the famous story is that Robert Giroux said we can't publish this. It's just and the famous story is that Robert Giroux didn't like, just thought it was too that it was too raw or something like that. That it was, that the prose was wrong, something like that. But according to what Robert Giroux said, he took a look at it and he said, we won't be able to typeset from this, and the thing is, and he says, and then the story is, well, he suggested to Kerouac that he type it up in a manuscript, and Kerouac got all indignant. He said, this is the way it came out. And this everyone agrees on that Kerouac said. He said, you've offended the Holy Spirit. Because the Holy Spirit was speaking through me when I wrote this. But the thing is, Kerouac had already started retyping it when he went in to see Robert Giroux with it. He knew that. You see, a lot of this is just, he knew very well that. So he's actually retyping it already and making some changes.
So, books like this have so many myths around them as well as realities. And you're already talking about some of the myths. I mean, when you said the Holy Spirit, I think Benzedrine and speed.
He actually drank coffee only when he was writing.
Is that right? Okay, so the Holy Spirit was
famous. Everyone thought he was on speed because in the opening pages of On the Road, when Dean Moriarty is asking Sal Paradise for advice on writing, Sal Paradise says, my best advice is to stick to it like a Benzedrine addict. But so I think people thought Kerouac actually, but that was metaphorical. He did not actually write on, yes, he had an alcohol problem, as I think we're going to talk about soon, but he refused, he did not drink when he wrote. He wanted to be sober, and it was coffee only during those 3 weeks.
So we've just shattered a myth that I think a lot of people imagine. I don't know how many young writers have destroyed their lives trying to emulate that myth.
Yeah, thanks to American talk shows and journal and news magazine articles, Life and Look magazine articles.
So is he writing in between the writing of this in 51 and the publication? Is he writing things between this time? I mean, I
Oh
assume he's
yeah,
not just
yeah,
sitting
yeah. He
around
wrote
waiting for On
the
the Road.
total of, because when Ginsberg, I wish I had my books in front of me, and you know,
We
um,
have pictures of them here, but
yeah, but let me know, because Ginsberg actually says, in the dedication to Howell, he actually states a number of novels in 1955. This is that Jack Kerouac had already written. Only one of them been published so far, The Town and the City. But he had actually already written at least a version of Dr. Sachs, a version of Maggie Cassidy, a version of Visions of Gerard, and these were his Lowell novels. These were novels about growing up in Lowell.
can we? Are they going to be these novels here?
Dr. Sachs is the one I included because that's my favorite.
Mhm.
It's a fantastical novel. Yes, he wrote that. I think the name Dr. Sachs comes up in the 1940s, and the idea that he's going to write something like this.
Mhm.
He also called it Faust Part 3. It's subtitled Faust Part 3. You open to the title page, it's subtitled Faust Part 3. Well, why is that? Well, Faust is a story. I mean, and I'm sure that if there are any Germanists in the audience, please forgive me. But I mean, one of the things that Faust is a story about is what technology can do, and coming to grips with technology and its possible destructive powers. I mean, it's Goethe's writing this in the late 18th, early 19th century. I mean, it's about a lot of other things too. And the philosopher, well, sort of philosopher, historian, Oswald Spengler, who wrote a really influential book in the early part of the century, The Decline of the West, had narrated Western civilization in terms of the Faust legend, building increasing technology or something like that. Civilization starts, the civilization becomes decadent. And Kerouac wanted to tell a French-Canadian story about the rise of civilization. I mean, there's a wonderful passage in the book that, as far as I know, I'm the only scholar to have written anything about. It's written in French with a translation in English follow. It's about the fall of Quebec. It's about the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, in which General Montcalm loses to General
Wolfe.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, okay, yeah. Yes, it's about that battle, and it's about his uncle. It's about his uncle telling that story
Wow.
about the battle,
So,
and yeah, it's a.
So he writes Dr. Sachs before On the Road is published. On the
Yes.
Road gets published, and he becomes famous.
Yes.
That's
yes. In
accurate?
1957, On the Road came out. Oh, and I have a wonderful story that's probably too long to tell about how it, by fluke, got a good review in the New York Times, because the main reviewer, Paul Marion, is raising his hand. I think Paul Marion needs this. Paul Marion has actually edited a book of Kerouac's. He's from Lowell, Massachusetts, from the French Canadian community.
Paul, what I'm going to ask you to do, I'll say this to everyone.
I will yield to Paul. Paul, every time I say something I'm not sure of, I think Paul's gonna nail me on this one. But Paul, go ahead.
Is that something we can do, Paul Bonici?
Sorry, hold on one sec.
I'm sorry. Paul Marion is one person I will yield to right now.
Okay, absolutely. We more friends and more friends, the merrier. I just also want to let everyone.
Paul edited the book, the collection Atop and Underwood, which is Kerouac's early writings, the very earliest writings.
Let me just say, for the sake of time, if we can't get Paul, you can, and I say this to everyone, we're going to take some time. We're probably going to go a little bit over what we had planned on because we got a few more things to get through. But I want to mention, everyone, down at the bottom of your screen, there is a question and answer button. I would love to take any questions you have, and we'll try to get through as much of our material as we can. And if we can't get Paul Marion's voice up here, Paul, feel free to enter any comments you have down there, and we'll make sure that they get.
Paul, if you want to write something in the chat, I'll read it as soon as I see it. Okay.
Great. I thank you for that, Paul. So let's,
you.
I want to, his fame, it comes up. So he keeps writing, of course. And will he ever does he have continued success?
It's uneven. It's with On the Road. Yes, it was Satori in Paris. That's 1966, and it's a fictionalized version of his trip to Paris in 1965. Paris and Brittany looking for his French heritage. Would you like me to talk about this, or talk a little bit more about what happens?
No. I just was pulling up other works. I'm not familiar with when they're in, but let's talk about other works that he published in the wake of
On the Road. I mean, with On the Road, he already drank fairly heavily. It was just something he wanted. He did actually make efforts to stop. It wasn't as he knew it was a problem. And because with On the Road, when On the Road was published, and it got a review by fluke, I don't have time to tell the story. It's a wonderful story. By fluke, it got a good review in the New York Times. It got a rave review in the New York Times. While the main New York Times daily reviewer was on vacation, Orville Prescott, he was on vacation, and he absolutely hated the Beat Generation, would have given it the absolute worst review ever. He was on vacation. Gilbert Milstein reviewed it and gave it a rave review. And according to Joyce, he was staying at Joyce Johnson's place in New York City at the time. She said the phone started ringing off the hook the next morning after the review in the New York Times. Oh, okay. Paul said he's just come in a little bit late. Okay, so all right, I guess Paul is somebody.
No, we're gonna. It looks like Paul has put that. Paul Marion wrote in the questions. Sorry for being a bit late. We had ice dams in Amesbury, Massachusetts, so that took me away. Try to get my voice working. Eager to take part. Okay. Why don't we get to that when we cover some of the other material? Because we have about an hour that.
The thing is, it was just that the phone started ringing off the hook. He started drinking much more heavily at that point. So, and he was actually uncomfortable with the publicity.
Is that right?
Very uncomfortable with the publicity, yes.
And was he the type of writer that was then recognized? Were there, magazine photo covers of him?
Yeah. And a lot of it was contemptuous, just, for example, John Updike wrote a satire in the New York, who was a young staff writer at the New York Times, wrote a satire called On the Sidewalk, I think it was called. And it's a story written in a pastiche of Kerouac style, written about guys riding their tricycles around. And then it turns out at the end that they're 35 years old. And I think that really encapsulates the kind of mockery that they invite. Yeah. Even though Updike later came to admire Kerouac, but then it was fairly easy to write that kind of satire.
And so there's a professional disdain for this type of work, but there's also a growing mystique about the Beat Generation.
Yeah.
And was he self-conscious that this was becoming, something that lived out, like we said in the very beginning, he's becoming part of something that's bigger than him, or that's. And how does he feel about that, the Beat Generation?
Oh, he doesn't like it at all. I mean, he kept using the word. And he said, in fact, in Desolation Angels, the 1965 novel I mentioned a little while ago, where he actually speaks pretty disdainfully of the young people trying to be hip beatniks and so forth that they run into, and the ones who say like every other, they say, like, here we are in Morocco, like I'm meeting Allen Ginsberg, like, man, that kind of thing. It's just, he has disdain for that. And then, but at the same time, he uses the word beat, and he says beat meant it's beat in French, beat, meaning blessed, beat as in beatitude. Yeah. And he also said it's the beat, he said it's the drum beat. It's the drum beat, he said also, he originally heard it, he said in the southern United States, he said black people used it, probably in North Carolina, because he spent a lot of time here. His
in Rocky Mount, right?
In Rocky Mount in Kinston, actually. Okay. Yeah. He used to go hang out there. But he said, and beat meant poor, beat meant poor, beaten down, and so forth. And he said he wanted to encapsulate all of those things, but it was the idea of being beaten down and blessed at the same time, which, mind you, was exactly the condition that the French Canadians perceived themselves in.
Yeah,
absolutely. Beaten down by that situation, but for having been beaten down, blessed.
And also, I hope we get a chance to briefly touch on, it's also a very, very, Christian sentiment,
absolutely,
on the Mount type of, and his Catholicism is something I'd be interested in touching on.
The road is a Christian idea. And in fact, the road initially, the road was the road to North America from Quebec. And it was the road of bringing Christianity to North America. That's a huge topic. That's part of the book I wrote, which
it's possibly also related to the pilgrimage to Santiago, this notion of the spiritual journey or whatnot, and on the road.
He has, in fact, he gets fascinated with the Virgin of Guadalupe and the Mexican Virgin. And in fact, he speaks. He has this wonderful moment in Desolation Angels when Jack Duduos, that's his narrator's name at this point, his mother, he describes as kind of racist. She's visiting in Mexico, and suddenly she has this epiphany that they're just like us, because she sees the Mexicans going to church, the Catholic churches, and she says they're just like us. And in fact, he has an identification. He said that Mexico City reminded him of Lowell. Burroughs kind of made fun of that idea. What is he talking about? It's just like, because it's this very Catholic kind of peasant life.
And interestingly, like what Lowell really is, a similar thing would be a Mexican community within the United States would be more similar to what Lowell is. It's almost like he went to, by going to Mexico City, he's going to Quebec City in a way.
Kind of, yeah. We're in south of the border again.
I want to just welcome a person I've never met before. Is down in my lower left-hand corner, a gentleman by the name of Paul Marion.
Hello, Paul. How are you? Thanks for coming.
This is a first for us to have two friends. Paul, you're no longer a stranger to us. You're now officially a friend. So
can I give a brief introduction? Paul is a yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Paul is a writer. Also, Paul's a poet. In fact, my first encounter with Paul Marion, when I was in Quebec in 2007, I bought a book called Quebec Kerouac Blues, which is a whole bunch of poems from a festival, and that was in 1988. Is that right?
1987, the international gathering for Jack Kerouac.
And I picked it off the shelf from a used bookstore, and it had been signed to someone by Paul Marion.
Oh.
Yeah, I still have that copy.
I'm glad they kept it in the marketplace.
Well, yes. The person you dedicated it to sold it, but I bought it then, which was the right thing, I think.
Yeah.
So
that Paul, you've been. I signed 500 in a nightclub with Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg. So I'm kidding. But he did have
so Paul has been very involved in Kerouac activities for a very long time. In fact, he was one of the proponents of the Kerouac Memorial Park in Lowell, which is one of the most beautiful monuments to an author I've ever seen.
Oh, great. Well, so Paul, you wanted to have an intervention here, and we welcome your intervention. What is it that piqued your interest in what we were talking about?
Well, I'm a big fan of your main speaker here. I mean, I think you've just done fantastic work, and
I'm a big fan of you too. So.
And we're social media friends, and I was very enthusiastic about this broadcast. Seeing that the North Carolina Humanities was getting behind it, and so I was mostly thinking I'd be like looking in. I'm happy to participate in any way. I don't know if there were some things that came up in the earlier part of the session that I might have something to say about, or I could give you a kind of update on what's going on regarding the Jack Kerouac Centennial, the planning that's going on in Lowell.
Of course, next year.
Yeah. So 100th anniversary, March 12th, 2022. So there's a lot of activity, both at University of Massachusetts Lowell and with the, excuse me, the longstanding Kerouac organization in Lowell called Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. So, I mean, one of the things they're sort of negotiating about right now is to try to get the On the Road scroll back for display in one of the National Park museums in Lowell.
Where is that scroll right now?
Well, it's been traveling. It might be on the road itself right now. Since it went to University of Indiana. I think it's University of Indiana, not Indiana State.
Yeah, it's University of Indiana in and it's housed at the special collections there. The owner is actually Jim Irsay, who owns the Indianapolis Colts.
Oh,
and the curator, who's a wonderful curator and a lover of books and everything book related, is Jim Canary.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to have a curator like Jim, for this particular artifact. I mean, it's an extraordinary literary artifact. But there'll be events in Lowell, and we hope by then the virus fog has lifted, and from March all the way through the fall, I think there'll be a lot to see and do in Lowell. This 100 years only comes around one time.
And it's so nice to think that I like to imagine this time where we will actually be able to be in a 3D setting, enjoying the humanities together. So I don't know if you heard, I'm from New England. I've been to Lowell several times. I would
Oh,
love to stop through for there.
It's a
So
wonderful town. I mean, besides the Kerouac material, there's the whole Mill Museum, which is a good part of the town is and the town is like a museum itself of old New England. And it's, I mean, to me, that was wonderful because I grew up in Connecticut mill towns around Norwich, Willimantic, which had been booming towns in the 19th century. Norwich was the wealthiest town in the country, but these towns were impoverished when I was growing up. They were in ruin with empty mill buildings, rows and rows and rows of tenements. And then I go to Lowell, and it looked like the towns I knew, but it was alive, and everything was open.
Yeah, I mean the you know, if you sort of kind of widen the lens a little bit, the the most important recent thing regarding Kerouac that's happened in Lowell is the increased attention at University of Massachusetts Lowell. There are now 2 websites, jackkerouac.org and jackkerouac.com, that carry Kerouac material. The Kerouac.com is relatively new and is also the site where people can join the Jack Kerouac Society, which again, is something pretty recent. The English department at the university maintains the jackkerouac.org site. And also there's a major Kerouac Papers operation going on right now because the university came into possession of basically a copy of all the materials that is at the New York Public Library, and they've been cataloging and getting that all ready for researchers who might want to look at the material in Lowell as opposed to going to New York City. As Hassan said, the advantage of doing your Kerouac research in Lowell is that you're in a kind of living museum that hasn't dramatically changed, in a lot of ways from, the mid 20th century, when Kerouac was there on the streets. And I mean, you can pick up Dr. Sachs and Maggie Cassidy and Visions of Gerard and use them as guidebooks, and find your way around the city. All the streets and almost all of the buildings are still there.
Well, it's going to be a great resource for Kerouac scholars in the future, and I'm glad to hear that Lowell is able to. When Kerouac shines that light on Lowell, and people in Lowell were saying, "Oh, it might be a little too bright," I think that discomfort is fully past, and now Lowell is embracing.
There was some controversy. The descendant of that controversy around the town and the city, and Kerouac's depiction of it came up when you were planning Kerouac Park. There was staunch opposition to it, Paul.
Well, there was some opposition. The story got a little skewed, in the media, which of course, they love a controversy.
Yeah.
But, to just give you an example, I had a Wall Street Journal reporter come and see me in 1987 after the vote was made in the city council to go forward with a federal grant, for the Kerouac commemorative. And the vote was 7-1. And there had been 2 other public votes by the Preservation Commission that were unanimous. And so I told the Wall Street Journal reporter, the story here is in controversy, it's consensus.
Yeah.
It's that, the community has come together and agrees that this significant author, should be recognized, and that that's significant. And she said, "Well, my editor is interested in controversy. I don't want that story."
So go get the one person, right? Get the one voter.
Yeah,
Wasn't the guy pretty? The guy was pretty vocal, though, wasn't he?
Oh no, he was very vocal, but again, he got picked up, and his, the one opponent, got magnified because it fit a narrative, a kind of pre-existing narrative that Lowell didn't give a shit about Kerouac.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
so
And also, yeah.
Lowell, it's like
well,
Lowell couldn't win for losing. So
Mhm.
for, from 1969 to 1987, reporters would drop in and, they'd find people, who had negative things to say about Kerouac. And then they'd say, oh, Lowell doesn't care about Kerouac. And then, when this major decision was made, they still wanted to tell the story that the community was rejecting, this, avant-garde prose writer, who, had written 5 books about the city. So,
Mhm.
but we've come past that, in many respects. Like I said, the university is now kind of standing up for Kerouac. There's been an annual festival, every year, since the beginning. There wasn't this past fall because of COVID. And so there's a kind of, institutional support for Kerouac, that wasn't there, from 1969, in till the 80s, in a very public sense.
Mhm.
Although there were always people who understood, why Kerouac was significant, but the kind of average person on the street, interviewed by a reporter, might say, oh, I didn't read that. But you could go to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and ask them if they read Kerouac, and they wouldn't have read him there either. So it wasn't
Yeah.
particular to
Well, it's
Lowell. Lowell wasn't Berkeley or Greenwich Village or whatever.
Right.
Well, it's certainly wonderful to see that Lowell is going to be, like I said, a place where people can, maybe the pilgrimage, we mentioned the word pilgrimage before, people go on the road to Lowell and take advantage of those wonderful resources.
Right.
I want to say that we're already going over time, but I do want to get to a couple things. And I also, if it's okay with our main friend, Hassan, and our new friend,
Well,
Paul,
thank you, Paul. Thanks for coming.
to
Appreciate
stay
it.
on for just a moment or two. I'm going to skip ahead to those French slides, if I could,
Yes.
Hassan,
Yes.
so you
I'd
can
like to
speak
talk
a little
about
bit
those,
about
yeah.
that. And I'm going to please invite, I will go about 10 minutes over here. I'm going to invite anyone to add any questions to the Q&A button there, and I will get to them. But let's quickly look at this other thing. I'm sorry we didn't get to look at visions of Cody.
Yeah, we can skip that, but the French stuff is interesting, which was
yeah,
not. We can go to
and
the
I'm going to
slide.
start
Yeah.
with what I see here. I
Yes.
see it in French.
Yeah, Jack Kerouac, La Vie est dommage, and the title is actually a pun, which was Kerouac's pun, which is a phrase from Visions of Cody. La vie, life is, and dommage is homage. It's the same word in English. Everyone
Yeah.
says homage, but the English word is actually homage with one M. But it means the same thing. La vie, so life is to be honored, but also dommage, it's a pun. The word dommage means shame. So it's the same kind of pun as beat, blessed and beaten down. La vie est dommage, which he loved. He had any number of variations on that idea.
And this particular collection is a collection of French writings?
Yes, it is. It's all of them are in French, previously unpublished, text inédit, that's previously unpublished text, edited and introduced by Jean-Christophe Cloutier, who's a professor of English from Montreal originally at the University of Pennsylvania, a very good friend of mine. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that was, these writings sat around for didn't exactly sit around. I mean, people in Lowell knew all about them. Mm-hmm. When the archive was in Lowell, when it was released to the public in 2006, when it was open to the public, the Jack Kerouac archive in the New York Public Library, immediately this was massive news, earth-shaking news that Kerouac had written in French in Montreal, but also in Paris. It was a really big deal because Kerouac, I mean, unlike in the United States, where Kerouac is sometimes dismissed as a writer, in France, he's considered one of the greatest American writers. He has been for a very long time. In Quebec, of course, he's hailed not just as a great writer, but as a local hero, great writer, and someone who wrote about the French-Canadian experience in America. Some of his writings are regarded, the letter I mentioned that he wrote to Yvonne Lemaitre in the fall of 1950, after he read her review, September the 8th, 1950, that's regarded, I've seen that in books on the subject as one of the most important documents by a French-Canadian living in the United States about French-Canadian life.
Wow.
Dr. Sachs has been called one of the most important novels about French-Canadian life in the United States. It's but anyway, these he wrote, curiously enough, when he says to Lemaitre in September 1950, I can't hide my French Canadianness anymore. I'm going to write a novel in French. And he writes, then, could you go to the next one? He writes,
Yes.
La nuit est ma femme, the night is my woman. Winter, spring, 1951. Notice that this is just before he writes On the Road, just before he sits down and writes the scroll, just before he writes what he sees as a more authentic type of writing in the first person than the town and the city. He writes in French. Les travaux de Michel Bretagne, the labors of Michel Bretagne. And notice it's Le Travailleur. I don't think he was thinking of Le Travailleur in Worcester, but it's a very important word, a very, very Catholic word, the labors, the travails. And Winter, Spring, 1951, J'ai pas aimé that's the first, J'ai pas aimé ma vie. I haven't liked my life. C'est pas la faute à personne. It's nobody's fault, sans que moi. It's nobody's fault except for me, except for my own. And Ankh is a it's a French Canadian expression. It's in the Quebecois and the Massachusetts dialect.
I had mentioned to you, of course, being a historian of France, I read French, but I'm like, I'm not really familiar with that word.
And again, as I mentioned to you earlier, I mean, it's a combination of writing it as people spoke it, because he knew he at some points in his life was fluent in formal French. I mean, it came. I mean, anyway, I'm a French professor, but if I stop speaking for a year, I lose it. You know, it's. And then, but he wrote it as people spoke it.
Yeah.
So he didn't write the formal ce n'est pas. He wrote c'est pas la faute. And I can't do the pronunciation. I'm sure Paul could do the pronunciation beautifully, but I mean, I say I'm like an American actor trying to do Shakespeare in a British accent when I try to read Kerouac's Quebecois French, because it's an accent. It's a very different accent.
The language of my parents and grandparents. The sound. This, Kerouac, like, amazingly reproduced on the page the sound of the oral French of the Lowell French Canadians.
But he also wants to show the impact of English on the language. For example, writing drôle, which is a French word, but it's spelled the English way. In French, it's spelled D-R-O-L-E, and he spells it here with. Could we go back to the previous one?
Yeah, I was looking for. I was wondering where that was. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's right. It's the fourth line in the text. There you are. Drôle. He wanted.
They spoke. They blended. They merged.
Yeah.
It was a very creative oral expression.
But there's also a few times he uses archaic spellings. If you could go to the next page, I'll show you one. Toward the bottom of the page, et coupa les têtes, second line from the bottom, about 2/3 of the way through, tête. And that's the old French spelling, not old French, but the medieval to 18th century spelling of tête. They got rid of the S because nobody pronounced it, replaced it with a circumflex, but it's tête. And he used these archaic spellings to indicate that this is an archaic language. There's a notion, which is not quite true. I mean, but that the French they speak is unchanged from the 16th and 17th century. It's true that you do find words in it to this day. Words. I mean, I have a Quebecois dictionary. Words that are used that I know from studying 16th century French that are not used in contemporary French. So there is some truth to that.
But all languages are alive and change, right?
Yeah, but he did that to indicate that this was a French that harkens back to an older French, to an older time when people came over from France a very long time ago, and also just the spellings are off. I mean, he uses a lot of Z's. I pointed out Z's where you wouldn't, and that makes it look like 16th century French from François Rabelais, one of his favorite authors in French.
And he also has these, les vieux suitcases.
So he wanted to indicate, he wanted to write a French that was not metropolitan French. It was not official French.
Yeah.
But there's not, but he wanted to indicate that there was nothing wrong with this, that this in itself is it's also a language. It's not an invalid language. It's not a secondary language. It's a real language.
Was he reading French 20th century authors,
Yes,
Céline, Louis
Céline
or...
was one of his favorite writers.
Okay, yeah, I was
Actually,
thinking I could see the connection between something like Journey to the End of Night
Yeah,
and...
and Céline, who was also one of Céline's favorite authors, was also Rabelais too. It's he bases his narrative. So anyway, but this is so. But he wrote the one novel just before, the one novella in French just before writing the On the Road manuscript. And then Sur le Chemin is right after. It's a few months. It's a little bit. Could we go back to that one?
Yes, Sur le Chemin, which sounds like on the road, doesn't it?
But in French, the word you would use is la route. Sur le chemin is kind of, it means more like, it's a word you would have used for road a few hundred years ago. I mean, well, it still means road. It means more street now, something like that. But it means way. Sur le chemin means on the way.
Yeah, on the way. I was gonna say, because like a chemin or like a chemin de fer.
Mind you, it's le chemin de la croix, the way of the cross. That's the expression you'd use. So again, it's just the road is something spiritual, and the road is about migration. The road is about the migration from Quebec to the United States, and then the migration around the United States. It's not just about hanging out, hitchhiking, and getting stoned. It's about migration as something that really deeply affects the people.
Yeah.
And so Sur le Chemin, he wrote in 1952, and this was when he was rewriting On the Road. And there's a letter he wrote to Neil Cassidy, because it's about Dean Pomeroy, which was a name he gave to a Neil Cassidy character. Fourth line, Dean Pomeroy Jr. And he said, I rewrote it in French, and I solved all the plot problems. That's what he says. So between the letter to Le Temps de City, the letter to Yvonne Lemaitre, and mind you, I'm not saying this is the only reason he chose to write the way he did, but going into writing in French had a great deal to do with why he changed his style of writing. The spontaneous prose, writing quickly instead of a lot of drafts and rewriting, even though he ended up doing something like that with On the Road, and also writing in the first person and writing about something much closer to himself. And he went into French to do that. And he went into French, not just to get the experience, but to get the texture of the language and the writing.
You know, I'm almost feeling here. Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, just a little Lowell trivia. And I don't know if it's an unconnected dot or an unrelated dot, but in the 1920s, there was a physician in Lowell named Dr. Roy, and he published a book of poems. It was called Voix étranges, Strange Voices. And Dr. Roy, I'm blanking on his first name right now, but Dr. Roy was a reader of the Symbolistes. So he in 1920s, you have this medical doctor in Lowell, highly educated, who was a fan of Baudelaire and Rimbaud. And and his book's all in French. If you look at some of the titles, they're eerily kind of forecasting Kerouac language. And I should send this to Hassan, because
I would love to see it. Yeah,
I've never seen any evidence that Kerouac read Dr. Roy, but the book was published by the newspaper, which was also a publisher that his father worked for, L'Etoile, which was a very kind of high-minded French language newspaper.
It was a daily also. It was a daily until 1950. Then they went to 3 times a week.
Yeah.
Until 1957. The last issue was the week On the Road came out, by bizarre coincidence.
So L'Etoile published Voix étranges, and there are not many copies of the book is circulating. I happen to have one, but it's just interesting. It speaks to the kind of cultural milieu that Kerouac came
pulling from the same soup, right?
It's like the French Canadian milieu wasn't a big pot of steaming mill workers. You know, there were social layers, castes, of working class and business class, and some elites, professionals. It's reasonable to expect that, Kerouac, would be, very much aware of that. Of course, his father,
Oh, sure.
had a printer for the newspaper.
Yeah, and I mean, it took some time, but yeah, because the first immigrants to Lowell are actually, I think it's 1835, French Canadian immigrants, but the first business license granted to a French Canadian was 1870.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say this is absolutely fascinating history about Lowell and about Jack Kerouac. And I just want to say there's so many things I wanted to touch on. I wanted to touch a little bit more on Catholicism and Buddhism. And which just says to me, we're going to have you back to talk more about Jack Kerouac, and we can find an excuse to do that anytime, right, Hassan?
I'd love to come back. As you can tell, I will talk about Jack Kerouac any chance I get.
The show is supposed to be 1 hour. We're already at 1 hour and 15 minutes. Let me just quickly ask if anyone has any questions at all for our panelists. And otherwise, we'll wait for round 2 of Jack Kerouac, or maybe we can team him up with somebody. So at this point, I do want to thank Dr. Hassan Melehy and also Paul Marion. Nice to meet you, Paul, and thank you for that great work you're doing up there. And my experience in Lowell is I've been to Lowell maybe 10 times, but it's always I pulled in at around 7 o'clock at night and left around 5 in the morning as a traveling musician. So I don't have a good sense of it besides what the bars are. The bars are pretty outstanding down in Lowell. At this point, folks, we don't have any questions right now, but I think that's because we have given people a lot of information to chew on. What I would like to recommend, Philippe Lebon is very into a round 2, so perhaps we can do that. If you're willing, Hassan, maybe we'll have you back in the fall to talk more.
I'd love to. Thank you.
We could do a little bit of a targeted talk about some of the things we didn't get to.
Yeah, if we, maybe,
Just hammer out some areas to discuss.
Okay.
And
Sounds
let
good.
me thank Dr. Hassan Melehy and also Paul Marion. And I want to thank Paul Benici behind the scenes for all the wonderful work he's doing, keeping us going, putting wonderful thing. Go look at the chats there. He's put wonderful links to a lot of that, including information on what's going on up in Lowell, as well as some of the text. And I just want to do one other thing and share one more thing, because we certainly want to be plugging the fact that our esteemed friend has a wonderful book on Kerouac, Language, Poetics, and Territory, which I'm sure delves into a lot of this work.
Published in 2016. And
2016. So you can find it order it at your local bookstore is what we always recommend.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. I want to wish everyone here a wonderful weekend. Have a happy Valentine's Day if you celebrate such things. And I just want to wish my dear wife, Kira, a happy 50th birthday today. Thank you all for coming today. And we did have a question about is On the Road an evocation of the medieval Catholic pilgrimage? And we did touch on that a little bit. Yeah. So you want to give a yes or no to that?
I just answered. I said not entirely, but a lot of it is yes. I mean,
yeah. So we did touch on some of that. So
in fact, that's because it's the road is. I mean, from there are allusions to Dante in it. Yes, and there are the road of life, he says, and it's. I'm sorry, I can't remember the details, but there's some lines in what he writes that are very, very close to the opening line of the Inferno. Of the Divine Comedy. So yes, that's part of it. Yeah, I mean, Kerouac is never just one thing though. When it comes full of literary allusions, but he goes in so many different directions.
Well, why don't we make sure for Kerouac Part 2 we touch on spirituality, because I'd love to talk about his Buddhism, his Catholicism, his purported conservatism, and things that we didn't get to touch on today. But we welcome you back at any time. I'm afraid, folks, that we have gone over, and I want to thank you all for coming. And we certainly will be talking to our esteemed guest again. Paul Marion, thanks for joining us. It's a great pleasure meeting you.
Happy. Thanks for taking on the subject.
Thanks for joining us, Paul. Great to see you. I hope to be in Lowell before long when all of this is over, and we'll get together. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next week. We have Dorothy Dandridge coming on to a wonderful look. We'll have Charlene Register coming to look at the fantastic Miss Dandridge and the wonderful work you did in screen and on the stage. So come and check that out. Go to humanities.unc.edu for all of our listings. Hassan, good to see you. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, you too. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.